Morning, everyone. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 87. House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, or as the PBO refers to it, the mighty OGGO. Pursuant to Standing Order 81.5 and the order of reference adopted by the House of Commons on Thursday, November 9th, 2023, the committee is meeting on the study of the Supplementary Estimates B 2023-2024. Just a reminder not to put earpieces next to the microphones as it causes feedback and potential injury to our valued translators. Today we have PBO office for 2 hours with an opening statement from Mr. Giroux. We're going to take a short suspension at 4:30 and we will welcome in Mr. Bill Robson from the CD Howe. And as required, just let everyone know that all audio tests for Mr. Robson have been done and we've found satisfactory. Mr. Giroux, welcome back again. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. We are pleased to be here to discuss our report on the Supplementary Estimates B for the fiscal year 2023-24, published on November 16, 2023. Joining me are Jill Giswold and Caitlin van der Wees, key analysts on this report. The government's Supplementary Estimates B for 2023-24 outlined $24.6 billion in incremental spending. Parliament's approval is required for $20.7 billion. Statutory authorities, for which the government has Parliament's approval to spend via other legislation, are forecast to increase by a total of $3.9 billion. Close to 50%, or $10 billion, of the proposed voted expenditures in these supplementary estimates relate to the Indigenous portfolio, with a significant portion for the negotiation and resolution of Indigenous claims. As for the forecasted increase in statutory authorities, it is largely driven by a $2 billion Canada Health Transfer top-up payment to the provinces and territories to help reduce backlogs and respond to urgent pressures, as announced by the government in June. Je vais maintenant continuer en français.
I will now continue in French. Approximately 11% or $2.8 billion of the expenses in the supplementary budget is related to 74 Budget 2023 measures. This brings the total proposed spending to date on Budget 2023 initiatives to approximately $10 billion for the 2023-2024 fiscal year. Including these supplementary estimates, proposed budget authorities since the beginning of fiscal 2023-24 reach a total of $480.5 billion. This represents an increase of $37.2 billion, or 8.4% over last year's estimates. To support parliamentarians in their review of Budget 2023 implementation, we have prepared and published tracking tables listing all budget initiatives, planned spending amounts, and corresponding legislative funding authorities. These tables, which are available on our website, will be updated throughout the year as the government presents its legislative agenda. On that note, we would be happy to answer any questions you may have about the estimates analysis or other studies produced by my office. Thank you.
Drew, before we start with Ms. Kusi, I just need about 5 minutes at the very end of today just to go over budget and also some of the document requests, just a bit of information from Dalian. Ms. Kusi, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and merci, Monsieur Giroux, pour être ici aujourd'hui.
And thank you, Mr. Giroux, for being here. It's always a pleasure to see you. We received a very interesting testimony from you in the past, and as I said, it's always a pleasure to have you here.
Being here on the supplementary estimates, I'm always very interested to get your insight into things. Obviously, what stands out is the total ask, another $24.6 billion in this time of economic crisis, with, of course, the voted authorities being $20.7 billion of that $24.6 billion, a significant amount, but of course, I'm mostly concerned about the $24.6 billion. Now, I know that you are no stranger to the fact that this committee has spent a significant amount of time on looking at the amount that this government has spent on external consultants. And in fact, last spring, we were seized with the McKinsey study because of the incredible amount of expenditures we saw on external consultants. And unfortunately, your report indicates that the supplementary estimates provide an insight into the fact that this government continues to have a reliance on external consultants. And in fact, you say that in your report that the amount that they are planning to save is a paltry $500 million. $500 million. This is just absolutely a drop in the bucket. Never mind the $15 billion that my counterpart, Anita Anand, the Minister of the Treasury Board, the President of the Treasury Board, promised to find by October 2nd and couldn't find. But you indicate in your report that the spending on the professional and special services continues to increase, and that in 2023, 2024, you state, it's at a record $21.6 billion. I'll repeat that number, $21.6 billion. Why is this government incapable of letting go of their use of external consulting services? Why is there a need for them to spend these exorbitant amounts on external consultants, as you indicated in your report, $21.6 billion?
I don't think it's for me to explain exactly why the government needs that money. I can say, though, that these professional services are used for a variety of purposes. For example, it can be on IT services that the government cannot do internally. It can also be for expertise that it cannot purchase or it doesn't have, and it would not provide value for money to develop it in-house. It can also be to provide some services to remote communities, for example, health services to communities. So if you have a specific question as to why the government keeps increasing its recourse to services, I would suggest that Minister Anand would probably be a better person to provide a justification as to why this is increasing. I would point out, though, that the $500 million in freezing voting appropriations, so the $500 million that was announced as part of the subsidy, is a small fraction of the lapse that took place last year for professional and special services. The government had booked $21.4 billion last year and lapsed 2.8 or 12.9%. So freezing $500 million this year does not sound like a very binding exercise.
And, I'll use this as another example here. That, it was recently reported that the Liberal government spent $669,500 on a KPMG contract to help reduce consulting in the Department of Natural Resources. So, again, we're just seeing this obsession with external consultants in this government, that they even have to rely on consultants to determine how to eliminate external consultants. But were there any significant reductions in consulting from this department, from Natural Resources? Can you see any positive impact of using consultants to help determine how to reduce consultants?
Well, the main or probably the only benefit I would see in using consultants to look at ways to reduce consultants themselves is maybe to get a second opinion in addition to the one that would be provided by senior public servants who would advise ministers and cabinet on the best ways to reduce the use of consultants. But it would seem a bit risky to rely solely on the expertise of consultants in that perspective. So I would see that as the only reasonable approach that would justify asking consultants on ways to reduce fees for consultants is to confirm what public servants would already have provided in terms of advice.
And finally, do these frozen funds have any impact on the government's debt servicing costs, or does it do nothing to stop the government from putting more fuel on this inflationary fire?
Well, it will have an impact on debt servicing costs to the extent that the money would otherwise have been spent, which may not be the case given that previous years' lapses on spending and on professional and special services. So the amount that was authorized to be spent but not spent was above 500 million.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Mr. Jouari, please.
Thank you, and Mr. Giroux and your team. Welcome to OGGO once again. I'm going to actually go back to the fact that you highlighted that the cost dedicated to the professional and special services, and the fact that it's to the tune of $21.6 billion. Does professional and special services exclusively mean external consulting services, such as services from Deloitte, McKinsey, all those that we've heard?
It's a broad categories that includes several types of services. So consultancies, as you mentioned, are a component of it, but they're not by any means the vast majority of these.
Thank you. Can you give me the top 5 areas or services that is considered under professional and special services, and what is the largest part of it?
So the top 5 areas are engineering and architectural services, business services, health and welfare services, and of the top 2, there's historically there's been around $7 billion. Management and consulting contributes to around 5% of historical spending on professional and special services.
So management consulting is around $5 billion?
5% of the total.
5% of the total. So 5% of 20 would be like 1 point. Yeah. Okay. Great. So I'm very specifically interested in the health, the investment on the health services. Can you expand on that one? Where, how much, and where is that going to? What purpose is going for?
Are you referring to consultancies or
No,
the $2 billion
on the
Canada
professional
Health?
and special services. There's a category under health services. How much is that, and where is that going?
Do you know how much?
For this year, for the in-year estimates, we don't have the breakdown by area yet. That only comes with the public account, so we wouldn't know until next fall.
Okay, but how much of the 21.6 is actually on health?
We know that only after the fiscal year has
Okay.
ended, when we
Great.
get a breakdown from departments.
Great, thank you. Another area of interest to all of us here, and as well as the Canadian, is the inflation. We recently heard that the inflation is down from 3.8% to 3.1%, and I remember last year when you were here giving us when we asked what do you perceive we're going to be in 2024, and you said we're going to be somewhere at the upper end of the 1 to 3%. Well, we're at 3.1, and we still got a couple of months to go. I'm going to ask you the same question. Where do you think we're going to be in 2024 based on the new estimates and based on what you heard in fall economic statement?
Well, our economic and fiscal outlook, I have it here, suggests that we will be within the 2 to 3% range, and I'm trying to find it. So we estimate that for the average year, 2024, as an average, will be about 2.8%, and we should be closer to 2% by the end of 2024 if there's not any unforeseen event that changes that forecast.
Okay, well, great. My colleague touched on the lapse rate. And can you comment on the lapse rate and concern that you have about it?
It's not necessarily a concern, but the lapse rate is the portion of authorities that that Parliament provides to departments. So they have the capacity to spend up to these amounts, and the lapse rate is the portion that ends up not being spent. And it can be a concern if it means that departments are unable to spend in areas of priorities. So that could be a concern if there are dire needs that are not met because departments cannot quickly enough implement some initiatives. But it can also be a good thing if it avoids wasteful spending. So spending for the sake of using all of the appropriation. So it has to be looked at with a specific lens. You cannot just say that a lapse is a bad thing in absolute terms or is a good thing. So one has to look at the reasons behind a certain amount of lapse.
Thank you. And I would like to submit it more on making sure that we are using the fund appropriately. With about a minute to go, in your report on page 5, you talked about that last year, by this time, we had spent about 60% of the projected total budget of 2023-24, as compare. 2022-2023, as opposed that this year we've only spent 40% of that budget. Can you expand on that one?
So what we mean and what is in the report, I think, is that last year we were at 90% of budget initiatives that had been for which there were authorities provided. This year it's closer to 60%. Although after the publication of this report, we have received subsequent information from the Treasury Board Secretariat that suggests the number is higher, but still lower than 90%. Which indicates that the pace of implementation of budget measures is not as rapid as it was last year and in previous years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Vignola, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Giroux, Ms. Vanderlees, Ms. Griswold, thank you for being here today. Mr. Giroux? I have noticed many things in these supplementary estimates, but I see that there's a sum for catching up on annuities in the case of Treaty 8. The cost remained the same since the signature of the treaty.
Yeah.
Do you know where that's coming from?
Comme
So, concerning Treaty 8 signed between 1879 and 1921, the cost remained the same since the signature of the treaty. And in the case of the Robinson-Huron Lake treaties, nothing was done since 1875. So, does that mean that every government since that date chose not to increase their budget allocation to these First Nations? Is that one of the reasons why First Nations find themselves in their current reality with no drinking water, for example? What is the meaning, the impact of this today? We have to catch up on that, don't we? I wouldn't want to comment on the impact of any specific treaties. Throughout my career, I've worked on some of the aspects of our relationship between the government and Indigenous communities, and what I've noticed is that these issues are very complicated. So payments have not been increased for years and years, and very often that reflects the fact that claims are in negotiation. Sometimes that can take years. So that doesn't mean that services are not provided. Those are separate issues. Having said that, I can't specifically comment on those specific treaties. We don't have those details. We only have the figures that are given to us in the supplementary estimates. Thank you. What surprises me every time I look at the supplementary estimates is the number of times I write in my notes that there was an unexpected or unanticipated expense. According to you, from the $20 billion of supplementary estimates, what percentage should have been in the main estimates last spring? That is also a delicate issue. If you look at the agreements related to land claims, in some cases, when the main estimates come out, the negotiations are not concluded. So there's part of those amounts that you can't really predict when you're creating the main estimates. However, when it comes to regular expenses, if you're not dealing with any new expenses or unpredictable expenses, then it is a little more difficult to understand why those amounts were not included in the main estimates. That should be the default options to make your jobs possible. But I would say that I don't have a lot of information when it comes to specific operational budgets for departments. I've also noticed that there are grants in the supplementary estimates B. And once again, I have the same question. Are those grants unpredictable in your opinion? No. There is a certain predictability there, so that should be in the main estimates, unless you're dealing with an increase and then given the budgetary cycle, those expenses could have been added after the main estimates. So that is one reason why you would find that in the supplementary estimates. But in the normal course of things, those grants should find themselves in the main estimates. Thank you. You calculated the expenses for the CUEC, which is a little over $9 million. The finance minister told us that it would cost $2 billion. So a little over 900 million is very high, but it's good news overall. However, here's my question. Have you calculated the cost, the economic cost, for example, when it comes to insurance, employment insurance of companies that go broke? That's a difficult question because I would have to come up with a theory that has to do with the number of businesses that go out of businesses without having the statistics. Now, it is very difficult for businesses to continue operating in some cases if they can't push forward their refund plan, but we can't really estimate how many businesses would actually close as a result. Thank you.
Mr. Johns, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And I wanted to go back to the outsourcing conversation. Right now, it's predicted that the government's going to spend $21.6 billion in highly paid consultants and outsourcing for services for Canadians. Now, my understanding is that this is that they intend to cut 15% of what they've allocated for outsourcing, but that still doesn't even bring us back to 21, 22 levels. Would that be accurate?
If they do reduce these outsourcing contracts by 15%, it would certainly contribute to bringing these funding back to the authorities or the actual spending in 21-22. But what we have seen so far is a reduction of 500 million split between travel expenditures and consulting fees. So, and that is not sufficient to bring down the level to actual expenditures in 21-22.
So I guess what I find really alarming is you just did a report in terms of looking at the CEBA loan and the cost of the CEBA loan. You know, right now we've got 250,000 small businesses that have taken a CEBA loan out, businesses that close their doors to protect the health of Canadians, public health, and they took a huge hit. Clearly, the refundable portion would not be able to absorb the hit they took, especially when it comes to the hospitality industry, where very few businesses have been able to make any sort of payment, if any, a small portion of that. And through CFIB, looking at their stats, they're saying a third of those people literally just don't have the money and can't secure a loan. Would you not agree that if the government, you know, cut more on outsourcing, that they could afford the money that you've projected, $904 million, which, you know, I think is quite large in your prediction, given the fact that it doesn't account for businesses paying down their loans over that period. Maybe you can speak a bit more about your report. But for me, I find it very difficult that these businesses are going to take another hit, take it on the chin, and we're paying this exorbitant amount of money in highly paid consultants that are making profit. And of course, we're also learning that a lot of them are just making commissions while they're subcontracting out, and in their pyramid scheme that they've designed that's going on in a lot of these corporations.
Well, it's certainly a decision that the government could decide to make to, on the one hand, extend the deadline for CEBA repayments and finance that through a reduction in outsourcing and professional services. However, reductions in outsourcing services could potentially have impacts on the delivery of some services, depending on the areas that would be cut. So it's a decision that would be best left. Well, I cannot really say whether it's feasible without affecting services. It would depend where the cuts or the reductions would take place. But it certainly is an avenue for the government if it was to decide to extend the deadline for CEBA repayments.
I imagine if they change their commission set up and put a cap on all commissions on outsourcing, they'd be able to cover the extension of the CEBA loan. Something that I'm really disappointed that the Liberals aren't supporting and the Conservatives have not been active on. Now, in terms of the Indigenous services funding, you cite the increase, but we're hearing from Indigenous communities about the cuts to Indigenous languages, which are critically endangered. There's an urgent need for immediate action to ensure these culturally rich languages are not lost forever. Funding would allow Indigenous communities to develop and implement intensive immersion programs that have proven effective for creating new high-level intermediate language speakers in just a few years. I'm hearing this from Sashat Nation in my riding, a Hausat Nation in my riding. These are languages that were stolen through residential schools. Do you see anything in your report that where the government's failing to fulfill their promises when it comes to reconciliation?
What we have seen in the subs is significant increases in funding to settle claims that had been outstanding, but I don't see any funding that would be related to Indigenous languages. We have done reports in the past that looked at performance indicators for both departments, Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations, and we found that slightly more than half of the performance indicators were met over a certain period of time, which suggests that there is still room for improvement in the delivery of services for Indigenous Canadians by these two departments.
Slightly over half seems pretty far from what's needed. As New Democrats, you can imagine we're pretty happy to see the government finally introduce new anti-scab legislation we fought for. It's still got to pass. Workers will have far more power now that companies can't replace them with scabs during labor actions. However, the new legislation will significantly increase the responsibility of Employment and Social Development's Regulatory Board, the Canada Industrial Relations Board, who will need to make a determination on every strike. The board is already overburdened, so I would expect this massive new workload to come with new resources. But the opposite seems to be the case. This government wants to reduce ESDC's funding by $3 million. How important is it for the government to make sure that new initiatives like this are accompanied by corresponding increases to funding?
I'm afraid we're out of time, but maybe you can offer a very brief answer, Mr. Giroux.
It's not something that we have looked at, the anti-scab legislation or the replacement workers legislation, and whether there is associated funding with that legislation for ESDC to fulfill the obligations that will be imposed on it by the legislative provision.
Thanks very much. Mr. Chambers, please.
Mr. Chair, it's a pleasure to be at the mighty OGGO, as I understand or to refer to it as. Thank you for coming again. Welcome to your team. It's nice to see you. I expect we'll see you hopefully one more time at Finance Committee before we break for the holidays. I was looking at the supplementary estimates, and a couple things I didn't see, and wondering if maybe I just missed it. I didn't see any money set aside for the new disabilities benefit. I didn't see any money allocated for implementing pay equity legislation. And I have not seen yet any adjustments or additional money set aside for the dental care cost overruns, which I understand there are some accruing. Am I mistaken in not seeing that, or?
Well, I certainly have not seen anything related to C-22, which could be significant if or when we see regulations that will implement or operationalize the disabilities benefit. I don't remember seeing anything on pay equity in the supplementary estimates, neither for dental care.
Okay, so I've had a bit of trouble getting an answer from the Treasury Board, Health Canada, and Finance. No one really wants to give an answer to the question about the methodology that the government used to determine how much the dental care program will cost. Specifically, did the government assume a certain percentage of uploading from the private sector and public sector plans, in which case they've admitted that there will be some crowding out of the private sector? Or did they not make any assumptions at all, in which case there will be significant cost overruns as private sector plans, and including various provincial governments, are actually now kicking people off their plans so that the federal government can pay for it? I'm just wondering if you have the same concerns, or maybe you can help us get some of that transparent information in your work.
So I know when we did the costing of the dental care program, we consulted with Health Canada. I don't remember off the top of my head whether they have included some. I know we certainly have included some behavioral impact, but I don't know if they have included some potential offloading by currently insured individuals and families. So I'd have to get back to you on that.
Thank you very much. There's another area which the government outlines in every budget. It's called the non-announced measures. And what happens in this provision is every budget, the government is transparent about the changes in that account. Example, money comes into that account, money goes out of that account. They're very light on the details about what it's for. Understandable. There's some very legitimate reasons for which they would have some secrecy. Parliamentarians actually don't know the total dollar value of the provision that's set aside in the fiscal framework. It's my understanding you would have to go back basically to the beginning of time to add up and then track the change of that account. And I'm wondering if you may be able to provide some assistance so that parliamentarians could understand the total amount that the government's provisioning for future expenditures that they haven't announced yet, because we just listed a few that have not been accounted for publicly, but there's pharmacare is nowhere to be seen. We actually have no idea whether the government's put aside enough money for the liabilities that it's created.
It's information that we sometimes try to get. We see the line, a provision for unannounced measures or still to be announced measures. And every time we see that in a fall update or a budget, we ask, and we're told the same answer over and over again. We can't provide you the details because some of these are for anticipated cabinet decisions, others are for commercially sensitive contracts or negotiations. So we would probably face the same wall. And I can understand there are very valid reasons to want to provide not too much details on that, but the issue of going back several years, I think that would be a mission impossible.
So surely, though, it wouldn't be secret. What's the total dollar value of the provision in a gross number that the government set aside for future liabilities? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that should be doable.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you,
Chair.
Mr. Chambers. Mr. Sousa, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here again today. So the Governor of the Bank of Canada indicated recently after the Feds, after the fall economic statement, after the update, that, and I think his quote was, federal government's new fiscal guardrails are helpful for monetary policy in regards to how we move forward and to weather through these international challenges that we have and affecting us here at home. So as we go forward and we look at some of these measures and some of the things that we put in place, he commented that some of these steps are helpful. Can you comment? Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree that having a fiscal anchor is very helpful. It's helpful for Canadians. It's helpful for financial markets. But first and foremost, it's helpful for the government itself when it has to make significant decisions and trade-offs when faced with various demands. So it's something that is very helpful. And one thing that is important with a fiscal anchor is that once you decide on one, you keep committed to the same to ensure that the credibility is maintained of that fiscal anchor.
Thank you. In the Treasury Board Secretariat, there contains some settlements in votes 1B and 10B that we're discussing relating to the Phoenix pay system. And as you know, this saga seems to continue and never ending from a previous government as well. Can you comment on what these payments are for and how long do you foresee this being an issue?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. And as to how long these payments should continue, I would hope that we are close to seeing the end. But I would be very optimistic, I think, if I was to say that based on past experience.
And as we look and we consider our future economic position, I mean, it's one point to look at this point in time. So the Auditor General looks into things that have taken in the past. But your role, very much forward-thinking. It's a proactive situation. You're looking at what it is that we're going to be doing and how we're going to be able to withstand and prepare in regards to what's happening in the future and the benefits. And I'm now thinking about the benefits to the elderly, specifically in the medium term. Now, there will be increasing costs as a result because of the aging population, and it's had an effect on our long-term projections. Do you see that? Do you see that effect?
Yeah, we see expenditures related to old age security and the guaranteed income supplement rising as the population gets older and with inflation, of course, but the main driver is population aging. We also see the need for the healthcare sector increasing as the population ages, but given that the government at the federal level, most of its expenditures consist of transfer payments to provinces that are set in legislation and grow in line with inflation or GDP growth. Same with old age security, it grows with population growth and inflation. We see that the government's fiscal position, in the absence of further measures, should still be sustainable in an environment where interest rates return to a more normal level.
And the credit agencies would agree with you.
They seem to be in agreement so far with the credit rating being very solid.
Thank you. I think I got some more time.
You have a minute and a half.
Perfect. When I look at the accounting, and I guess I'm getting a little more convoluted here, but it's worth discussing the different methods of accounting for the budget and public accounts, where you use accrual accounting. So in estimates, we use the modified cash accounting. Can you briefly explain the two different methods and why they apply here?
Sure. So accrual accounting, for people who may not be familiar with this method, recognizes the expenditures as they are, like, they materialize. So not necessarily when you write the check, but if you know you owe amounts to a specific provider, or you have a liability, for example, with respect to future benefits, you have to recognize that expenditure. And when you get an asset, for example, you know you are buying warships, so you transfer cash, you get an asset. So it doesn't affect the bottom line, the deficit, in the first year where you transfer, you pay for the warship, but you get an asset. So it does not affect the deficit or the surplus. Modified cash means when you have to pay an amount, then you have to seek funding.
I apologize, Mr. Giroux. I realize you probably need 2 more weeks to try and explain our estimates process. But we're out of time. Ms. Vignola for 2.5, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to return to my question when it comes to CIBA. I know it's difficult, but in your opinion, will tens of thousands of bankruptcies have a bigger impact on the economy at the end of the day than pushing forward the reimbursements to CIBA? I can give you an economist's answer that might not completely satisfy you, but it depends on the employment situation. If there's full employment, then some realities are unavoidable. But if you look at the macroeconomic view, then employees that are affected by bankrupt businesses will find a new job within a reasonable time period. However, if there's higher unemployment than a normal rate for a dynamic economy, in that case, it will take longer for people to find a new job if their employers go out of business. So yes, it is possible, it's even probable that that tens of thousands of bankruptcies could lead to cost. Thank you. So our budget has increased compared to last year's budget. Last year's budget was the tail end of the pandemic budget. And so you could say that the last normal budget was 2018, 2019. So would you say that now our situation resembles the situation of pre-pandemic, or are our expenses much higher at this point? In terms of expenses, we're much higher than 2018, 2019. Even if you take inflation into account, there are expenses that have been added to the federal apparatus. That can be explained by personnel, but also other areas of intervention. Conscious decisions that were taken to have programs that are more generous and more numerous, and to have a bigger public service.
Past our time. Mr. Johns, please.
Well, I cannot actually comprehend the fact that we're post-COVID and the out-of-control consulting is still skyrocketing, and the government can find more money for highly paid consulting firms than finding it for small and medium-sized businesses that close their doors to protect public health, and they can't access CIBA loans. You know, I just find it absolutely unbelievable. I'm going to talk about Phoenix. The Conservatives started this Phoenix pay system that was supposed to save us $80 million a year. It's over $2.3 billion. Hopefully you can provide the amount that actually what it's really cost Canadians through their highly paid consulting, regime of their own and carried on by the Liberals. Do you have an updated number on the total amount the Phoenix pay system has cost us?
I don't with me right now, but it's something that we could probably provide in writing to the committee.
That'd be fabulous. Shared Service Canada is asking for another $34 million to fund the next generation human resources pay Human Resources and Pay Initiative. But there's no funding here for the Phoenix pay system. In June, you shared that the Department of Finance told your office the hundreds of millions were allotted to fixing Phoenix, that would fix it once and for all. Now, I want to ask you if service delivery has improved, because clearly it didn't. They're focusing on going after people that haven't been paid for work they did instead of overpayments, instead of paying the people that did work and not get paid. Almost 1 million transactions with financial implications are currently waiting in the pay center's queue. Do you see, what do you see that's needed to fix this? What resources are needed to make sure everybody gets paid that's owed money?
Honestly, sir, I have no idea what's needed at that point because it's been going on for a long time. And if I knew exactly what was needed, I would probably quit my job and sell it at a high price and fix it for good. And
I'm sure some highly paid consulting company would hire you in a heartbeat to do that. But a next generation initiative, it's supposed to save tax dollars and improve pay administration. There's $23 million here to fund a settlement related to Phoenix, but specific settlements like PSAC's agreement with the Treasury Board haven't applied to damages since 2020. Anyone harmed since 2020 isn't protected and can't claim damages. Have you costed extensions for any such agreements? And does it make sense for the government to be periodically allocating funds to various damages, or would laying it out upfront and all at once be more effective and transparent?
I'm afraid we're out of time, Mr. Johns, but I do see Mr. Giroux writing down your question. I'm sure he'll get back to us. Ms. Block, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I join my colleagues in welcoming you here today. I also appreciate your analysis on the supplementary B estimates. Mr. Giroux, at a previous meeting, you commented on the amount of spending that's finding its way into these supplementary estimates, and if my memory serves me correctly, you were concerned at the amount that was finding its way into the estimates and characterized it as a lack of planning. And I guess what my question for you is today, how do the estimates that we are looking at today compare to the estimates that would have given you that sort of concern previously?
That's an interesting question that I did not expect. So I would say that this one is probably less concerning to me because it involves a series of settlement for claims related to Indigenous people, which are hard to predict in advance. But even if they were predictable, it would be disingenuous on the part of the government to reveal how much it's prepared to put on the table before everything is finalized. So from that perspective, it is normal and expected that funding for these agreements finds its way into supplementary estimates. And given that it's a significant portion of these supplementary estimates, the other part being for budget initiatives, I have less concerns with the amount in these supplementary estimates, subs B, than I would have if it was not related to these specific items.
Okay, thank you very much. I do appreciate the role that you and your office plays in supporting parliamentarians by providing us with the economic and financial analysis that you do. And I understand that it really is intended to raise the quality of the debate that we have here in committee when we're looking at estimates, but also in the House. And it promotes greater transparency and accountability for the government. We also have, noted in previous committee meetings that it is oftentimes difficult to scrutinize the estimates, mainly because we are not given a lot of detail in some of the lines or itemized lists for the purposes of certain amounts of money. And my question to you would it be feasible to require departments to provide more detailed accounting or those lists that would provide more specificity on their planned spending?
It certainly would be feasible, and there are a couple of ways to make this job that you have easier. For example, having a budget that is tabled sooner in the cycle so that most of the items find their way into the main estimates as opposed to having mains and shortly thereafter supplementary estimates A. That's one way. There would also be, as was asked yesterday at the Senate National Finance Committee, when there are agreements for which funding is sought in supplementary estimates or the mains, indicating the year in which the liabilities were booked so that we have a sense as to how long they have been on the books of the government. So these are a few ways, and I'm sure I'll be running out of time soon, a couple of ways to make your jobs in scrutinizing government accounts easier.
Thank you. Do I
If
have
I
a minute?
have,
I have a minute.
go ahead.
Did you want to add something to that?
No, I was just going to say we take all the credits if our work elevates debates in Parliament, but none of the blame if it doesn't.
Thank you. So really quickly, I just want to ask about the purpose of the $1 allocated to authorize the amendment to the Revolving Funds Act for the Optional Services Revolving Fund. What can you explain that?
I cannot because I still have not figured it out. We have been working on the supplementary estimates, the fall economic statement. We haven't got to that point unless Caitlin and Jill know more, but I certainly cannot explain that specific area.
Okay, thank you.
Can you?
Very briefly.
Sure, I'm just happy to add a little bit. With the estimates, the votes are on dollar amounts. So the purpose of a $1 often is to change something within the vote, but they have to put a dollar so that it's changed when Parliament votes on it.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Baines, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Giroux and to our analysts for joining us today. Again, I'm going to pick up a little bit on what my colleague here, Mr. Sousa, was saying or asking about the different methods. In your view, which method is more appropriate for federal financing, federal financial documents, the accounting methods that you were talking about?
I think the accrual accounting method is much better. It's a better reflection of the actual flows and responsibilities, financial obligations, and revenues of the federal government, but it's confusing in the sense that it does not always reflect the cash needs of the federal government.
Okay, and then would it be feasible to use the same accounting approach for all financial cycle documents?
I think it would be leading to huge discrepancies. For example, in a year where we buy warships or fighter jets, then there'd be a huge hit on the fiscal bottom line if we were to use a pure cash approach to the government's books. But the Comptroller General would be in a much better position to explain the pros and cons of different accounting methodologies.
Well, you mentioned fighter jets. I just got a quick question on that. The F-35 life cycle cost estimates, do you have them available from other nations? And if so, are Canada's in line with other partners?
Yes, they are roughly in line. We looked at the Americans, and I think we also looked at other countries, but the Americans have a good historical records because they have by far the most of these fighter jets in use. So there's good data on that. And I think our costs overall are fairly in line with the Americans. The variable that drives some of the life cycle costs is the number of hours flown per year and per aircraft, and that's taken into account in our estimate.
I was just visiting actually the recently C-SPAN Vancouver shipyard and was able to see the icebreaker and there were some cost savings there. Have those been indicated in the supplements?
Yes, we usually use comparable and historical data based on specifications that are proper to the ships that the government is procuring, and also look at the experience of other countries.
Okay, thank you. And you've mentioned how higher than projected spending by provincial governments also pose a risk. an upside risk. So if provincial governments step up to help Canadians the way we have, how much could that positively impact our federal finances?
That's a good question. It depends on specifically which areas you are looking at. So, if it's assistance, for example, to help the unemployed, it could relieve pressure on EI, but usually it's more provincial spending is more in the area of training with contributions from the federal government. It could also be in terms of education, so post-secondary education, which helps people become more easily employable in areas that are in high demand. So these are a few examples where provincial spending can alleviate pressure on federal spending.
Just on that, then, on the CPP, how much, do you think that could impact?
It would depend the comparability with the Canada Pension Plan. So if an Alberta pension plan were it to happen, if it was to be significantly more generous than the Canada Pension Plan and cost more, it could have adverse impacts on the labor market and on the competitiveness of businesses. On the other hand, if it was to be less generous and less expensive in terms of contributions from employees and employers, then it could have positive impacts on the labor market and the competitiveness of businesses. But at maturity, it would also provide lower replacement rates for workers who contributed to an Alberta pension plan. So it depends on the design of the Alberta pension plan were it to be created.
Thank you very much. We're going to suspend briefly to bring in Mr. Robson from CD Howe. recall you were with us a few years back. We were talking about pension liability. So it's wonderful to have you back with us. Thank you for all the work you do with the CD Howe. And we'll turn the floor over to you for 5-minute opening statements, sir.
Well, thank you. I will try not to run over 5 minutes. I do want, though, to say, as I did right at the beginning, that the work that I want to profile for you, and of course, I'm happy to answer questions on anything else that the CD House has done, but in talking about the work on fiscal transparency, a big motivation is to really raise the profile of the work you're doing in this committee and similar work in Parliament. Because it's rather foundational to representative democracy that elected representatives should approve the Crown spending and taxation. We do have a strong tradition in this regard in Canada. Most countries would trade places with us if they could. Particularly pertinent to what I'll say is that we do have well-developed public sector accounting standards, and along with the legislative auditors, the Federal Auditor General and her colleagues across the country, we have strong mandates there and independence and capable staff. The best way for me to cut into my opening remarks is to say that notwithstanding these advantages, most people find public finances obscure. When I taught public finance, I quickly learned that most students just wanted to learn how to follow the money. These were smart, motivated students, but most of them did not really know how to get started on it. Many of you will have heard constituents expressing skepticism about not just how government manages their money, but the numbers they see and hear. I think there are some in the group with backgrounds in municipal governments, and you'll know that the situation at the local level is often quite bad. I've had more than one municipal councillor, former, say that they didn't understand their city's budgets, but while they were in office, they didn't want to admit that. And that just shouldn't be. It seems to me that anybody who is motivated and can add and subtract really ought to be able to make a start finding the key numbers. Certainly elected representatives need to be able to find them. And in the case of elected representatives, timeliness is an important issue as well, both before the fiscal year begins, early in the fiscal year, and then after it closes. So this is essentially the goal of the Institute's annual fiscal accountability report card. I think you have a copy available to you. I hope so. But if not, I'll just say we're trying to put ourselves in the position of someone who is motivated, numerate, but not necessarily expert, possibly time constrained as a member of Parliament would be. How easy is it for that person to confidently find and identify the key numbers, either at the beginning of the fiscal year to understand what's planned and approve it if necessary, and then afterwards to understand what happened and correct any problems that we find. In that report, we have a large table that summarizes the performance of the 14 senior governments using 16 individual criteria. I will not take you through that in detail. Happy to take questions. But if you look across the top of the table, if you do have it in front of you, you'll quickly give an overview of what we think matters most to parliamentarians and citizens. So with respect to budgets, we have timeliness, particularly before or after the fiscal year started. We ask about the placement and nature of the key numbers, consolidated revenue, expense, and surplus or deficit, consistent with public sector accounting standards. And we look at whether the budget provided comparisons to actual estimated results for the year, and also contingency reserves, something that came up, I think, earlier in the discussion. I'll move over to the public accounts block of the table, where a lot of the questions we ask are similar: timing, placement of the key numbers, comparison to budget. We ask if the legislative auditor gave an unqualified opinion, and if not, how much money was at stake. We also look at below-the-line adjustments. I'll skip back now and close on the estimates block of the table. We ask there also about timeliness. Higher is marks if you're ahead of the fiscal year beginning. A bonus point for main estimates presented simultaneously with the budget, where the federal government sort of tried and had a misfire. And then also about whether the estimates are consistent with public sector accounting standards or clearly reconciled with them. I'm sorry that Mr. Giroux did not have time to finish his comments. but we do think the estimates should contain numbers that are consistent with public sector accounting standards, accrual accounting, so that parliamentarians can easily see whether what they're voting is consistent with the framework they previously saw or not. We've had a lot of excellent feedback on this from elected representatives, from legislative auditors, members of public accounts committees, the Public Sector Accounting Board. I'd welcome thoughts from this group, both in this meeting and afterwards. The final column, it's a new one this year, and it's our attempt to capture the main estimates approval process. You'll know more about this than I do. In coming at it for the first time, we simply looked for published schedules, whether there was one available or not. The federal government got 2 out of 3 on this. Perhaps that's generous. Perhaps we should be looking at the proportion of dollar amounts actually voted. But that's our attempt to start it. And I do welcome the feedback. That concludes my opening remarks. I hope I was within time. And again, I hope the CD Howe Institute's work in this area is helpful to you and helps to make some of these documents a little less daunting to your constituents, to Canadians in general. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Robson. We'll start with 6 minutes with Ms. Kusi.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Robson, for joining us here today at the Government Operations Committee. It's a pleasure for me to see you out of the Civitas environment. So, again, welcome here. It's really nice to have you here. Thank you so much. You mentioned the main estimates. You mentioned, the supplementary estimates. I'm going to add another document here when the President of the Treasury Board, my counterpart as Shadow Minister for the Treasury Board, came into the House and was really proud to lay down this huge pile of documents, which were the supplementary estimates. She also presented with them the departmental reports. Now, I recognize a major theme in your report card is that the government should be significantly more proactive in their publication of financial documents and have greater transparency. Yet in the most recent Treasury Board Secretariat departmental results reports, they've stated that they have changed the cycle for updating department frameworks from every 1 year to every 3 years. And they claim that this change will increase accountability and transparency. Would you agree, Mr. Robson, that changing this reporting cycle from every year to every 3 years will increase government accountability?
I'm not familiar with the change that you just referred to, so I'm answering a little on the fly, and I stand to be corrected if I'm misunderstanding what's behind this change. But in general, I would have thought it makes sense to have a tighter reporting cycle. If I just go to some of the considerations that lie behind our report, we spend quite a bit of time talking about the speed with which different governments produce their financial statements. Speed is a good thing. It's good for accountability. You don't want results out at a point when it sort of feels like old news, and when if there was a problem to be corrected, it might be too late to correct it. And the speedy collection of information is valuable for all kinds of other reasons. If you're slow collecting your information for the year, you're naturally on your back foot when it comes to preparing your budget for the next year, because the natural place to start with many plans is to understand where you are and what just happened. So my quick reaction, and I admit it's not after having studied it, is to say it's better to have tighter reporting cycles. It's better to have the more frequent reporting cycles, and there's real merit in collecting and releasing information quickly.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, and I do believe that more frequent reporting leads to a higher level of accountability and transparency. You state in your report that you feel more optimistic about the federal government's financial reporting in the future. This is a two-part question. Why would you state that you feel more optimistic about the federal government's financial reporting in the future? Maybe because it might be a different government. And secondly, did the most recent estimates tabled reflect this optimism, or do they continue to fail on many accounts, would you say?
Well, the federal government's performance in our report card has recently been very bad. The failure to produce a budget at all in 2020, as everyone in this group will know, was unprecedented. and a dismaying thing to see happen because it appears as though there weren't the kind of consequences that one would hope for after world wars and other disasters had not prevented governments from presenting budgets. So, so relative to the F that we awarded that year, the federal government's performance is improving. When we look ahead in the report, we're able to look at the most recent budget cycle to get a sense of how things are developing. And so the federal government, in some respects, did improve its performance relative to where it had been. I would love to see the federal government do more. I made a quick reference in passing in my opening remarks to the aborted attempt. It was part of the 2015 election platform, and for a fiscal policy wonk like me, my heart beat faster when I saw the commitment to release the estimates along with the budget. Even after having spoken at some length to Scott Bryson about what happened then, I don't understand it. As you can see, if you have the table in front of you and you scan down, or if you're from, say, at the Atlantic region, the Maritime provinces that all do this, there's really no reason not to be able to do it. And it clearly, if you release your budget well in advance of the fiscal year with the main estimates, then the work of the parliamentarians in understanding the fiscal framework and being able to scrutinize it before money starts getting spent at the beginning of the fiscal year is clearly greater. In the case of the federal government, since I'm on the topic of timeliness, I will also add that the importance of federal transfers, other federal programs to the finances of other governments in the country, particularly the provincial and territorial governments, is so great that it really is incumbent on the federal government to get their numbers out early so that other governments have a chance to see them before they put their own plans in place. It's a kind of silly way if you look at the recent budget cycles that we've got a number of governments in the country. New Brunswick's a standout, always produces its budget well in advance of the beginning of the fiscal year. New Brunswick gets a lot of federal transfers. It's not easy for them, and it should be a lot easier. The federal budget should precede the New Brunswick budget so that they'd have a firmer basis for planning. So there are all kinds of reasons for the federal government to produce its budget and its estimates in a more timely way, and I'm not clear on why that isn't happening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Robson. I agree with your comments regarding Mr. Bryson. My understanding is he attempted to significantly change the public accounts, was prohibited from doing so. I'd like to know why, and I'd like to know what he would have done. Thank you very much, Mr. Robson.
I'm afraid I'm going to interrupt you, Mr. Robson, I'm afraid, because there is no time left. But perhaps Mr. Pawlowski will ask the same question. You have 6 minutes, sir.
No, I'm not going to ask the same question. Anyhow, Mr. Robson, so appropriately, I'm asking you a question. So I'm the Member of Parliament for Thunder Bay Rainy River. I would note C.D. Howe was from Thunder Bay. So maybe it's good I'm asking you a question. You talked about the importance of speed in government releasing its financial reports. So with that in mind, can I ask you your reaction to the fall economic statement, which certainly included a lot of numbers in terms of how the government is doing its financing, or is that not the kind of thing that you're interested in terms of government financial reporting?
Well, since you give me the opening, I will say that in our report, there is a column that looks at in-year updates. And I think those are good things. In fact, the federal government, with its monthly fiscal monitor, does provide a service to people who want to keep tabs on what's happening. There are some accounting issues as you go month by month, reconciling it to the year. I think the tradition of a fall economic statement is a very good one. For everybody who's looking ahead to the spring budget, what it can do is give a sense of, what happened in the economy. Are revenues coming in more or less as projected? What's happening to the spending track? What does concern me, we live in a world of, constant campaign communications, and everybody feels as though there have to be announceables every day of the week. And so that has caused fall economic statements, not just federal ones, but in the provinces that issue them as well, to sometimes be a bit like mini budgets, where you're getting all kinds of potential legislative changes introduced partway through the year. I think that's unfortunate. I think it jams the legislative process. It's much harder, similarly to when you're considering estimates late in the year, to really feel confident that you understand how what you're being asked to vote, how it fits into the framework, or if it doesn't, what kind of a change it's going to make. So I guess I've implicitly criticized the fall economic statement for having introduced some policy initiatives as opposed to just telling us here's how things are shaking up relative to what we expected. Of course, certain types of initiatives might well be necessary if you have a natural disaster. If a war breaks out, it's natural that you're going to have to change your plans, and you want to put those into the statement so that people can understand it's not just necessarily the GDP growing faster or more slowly or what have you. But in general, I think the fall economic statement is a good tradition, but I think that we should also be very careful about not expecting them to be all full of legislative changes and program changes that, as I say, jam the parliamentary process and undermine the credibility of the budgeting process at the beginning of the year. If you know that after a few months there's going to be a very significantly different fiscal plan, not because of circumstances beyond the government's control, but because they changed their minds about what they're going to do, then what that does is it really casts a bit of existential doubt about the whole budget process. I mean, it's supposed to be the foundation of representative government in the financial sense where parliamentarians consider it. It's taken very seriously. It's voted. Government stand or fall on it, and then a few months later you might discover that they're actually planning to do something quite different. So I like the institution, but I'm not sure we're using it wisely.
No, Mr. Robinson, I am a Liberal member of Parliament, and certainly the Liberals, and it's in our best interest to portray a rosy view of the economy. But I would say in the Minister of Finance in presenting the fall economic statements had a lot of good things to say about the economy. The fact that we have the lowest deficit in the G7, the lowest debt to GDP ratio, we're third highest in terms of direct foreign investment, which certainly looks good. Suggesting that companies around the world want to invest in Canada, low employment rate, deficit, 40 billion, I think is the projected numbers. Do you disagree with any of that? Because certainly the Minister of Finance tried to, and I think did, portray a fairly rosy view of the economy. Do you disagree with those numbers or that outlook?
The comparisons internationally are certainly favorable to Canada, so I agree with that. I will point out that when you are netting assets of the Canada and the Quebec pension plan or some of the big public sector pension plans against the liabilities of governments that when that money is already spoken for other reasons, you're not misrepresenting the picture as it would appear to a foreigner, but you are overstating the degree to which the federal government itself might be able to service its obligations. So there are some nuances there. In a way, also, it's to compare ourselves to some of the fiscal problems abroad. It does make us look better, but sometimes I think, well, if the rest of the world's in tough fiscal shape, maybe the U.S. is in worse fiscal shape than us. They certainly are. But when we're all trying to finance ourselves, it may be that they're a little more easily able to attract the financing. So when I step back and I look at the big picture, I don't disagree with some of the specific comparisons that were made in the fiscal update, but I think it understated the economic and fiscal challenges in front of us. You'll recall in the spring budget, there was a projection from the OECD. As it happens, a former C.D. Howe Institute person who I think very highly of was in on those one of the authors of that study. So it had just carried a bit more weight with me. Showing Canada
I have to cut you off there, Mr. Robson. I apologize.
I was digressing a little. Please excuse me.
Ms. Spignola, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Robson, I visited the Institute's website to look at the report, and I noticed that it's only available in English. Do you have it available in French, or are you saying that finances and the economy have no interest for Francophones, even if the Institute was founded in Montreal?
No, that is not my intent. It is a matter of resources. The C.D. Howe Institute has a very small budget. And as a result, we are not easily able to publish everything in both languages as we would certainly like to do. So I apologize for that. If you would like anything particularly to be rendered in French, we would be pleased to do it. And I'm hoping that with advances, we have a large Francophone staff. Our senior, our VP of research and my frequent collaborator on fiscal policy also are Francophone. So
thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I noticed that bilingualism is very important for francophones, but the reverse is not always true. You said, Mr. Giroux, that the 2023-2024 budget, or rather 2022-2023, no, 2023-2024, thank you, was higher, much higher than the last standard budget, which was in 2018-2019. There are new programs, and some programs have been enlarged. And that raised a question in my mind. Quebec and Canadian provinces have been complaining increasingly of the federal government getting involved in provincial jurisdictions. For example, the federal government negotiating with municipalities, even though that falls under provincial jurisdiction. Do you think that the federal government's involvement in provincial jurisdiction might explain an increase in the cost of certain programs in the budget? It could explain some of the increases, including the transfers for the $10 a day daycares that partly contributed to increasing expenses. There are also other expenses, for example, the National Medicare program. If you look at the federal government's recent initiatives, if you consider that some are under provincial jurisdiction, then of course there are transfers of funds into sectors that traditionally fall under provincial jurisdiction. Infrastructure is an example where there is a high cost for the federal government that is transferring money to provinces and to municipalities. Thank you. In 2-3 of your report, it says that in 2018-2019, there was a decrease of 1.2% in terms of the public service staff. But the following years, there was a decrease that was 10 times as large. So what explains that fact, and what explains the current situation? Is it a healthy situation? Well, it's a question of expense in personnel, not the number of staff. So the increase is probably, rather the decrease is probably exceptional back in 2017, 2018. So it's more important to look at the trend. Is it worrying? Yes and no. It isn't, in the sense that the services provided by the federal government are improving, but it could be worrying if services were not improving, if there weren't more services, or if the quality of those services were not improving or were decreasing in quality. So that is what you have to look at along with the results. Thank you.
Mr. Johns, please, for 5.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the CEBA loan. So I want to understand this. Right now, it's projected there's going to be $21.6 billion paid out to highly paid consulting companies. And let's face it, 6 of those large companies are going to benefit the most, of these highly paid, profitable, companies. And I did the math, and it's going to cost $904 for the government to help protect 250,000 businesses that close their doors to protect public health by extending the CEBA loan for 1 year. The math says that that's about a 4.2% cut that it would require of highly paid outsourcing to cover the CEBA loan. Does that sound about accurate to you, that if we cut outsourcing by 4.2%, that would cover the costs of helping save 250,000 businesses, a third of which have identified they cannot borrow money from the bank. They will not be able to pay the loan and lose the 1/3 forgivable portion.
Your math seems about right if you look at $904 million, which is the cost that we estimate for an extension of the CEBA loan repayment period. That seems to be, roughly speaking, the right proportion of the overall special services and I think the exact spending on professional and special services. Sorry, so that seems to be, roughly speaking, the right percentages and proportion.
You know what I find just absolutely incredible is we've had more and more of these consulting companies appear before committee. We're learning that a lot of them don't even do the work, and they charge between 15 and 30% for commission. We've had IT specialists show up that don't even understand IT, or in terms of they're not experts really in IT. They're experts in finding people to do the work. And some of them don't have offices, some of them don't have staff. Just by reducing commissions by 4.2% on the $21.6 billion, we could cover the CEBA loan extension for 250,000 businesses. Does that sound about right?
I'm not sure what the commissions themselves represent as part of the overall spending on professional and special services. We haven't looked at the specific component as part of the overall spending in that category.
I bet you can't, because we can't even get to the bottom of how much is actually going in commissions, despite the many questions we've had here at this committee asking questions. Now, my colleague from Nunavut wrote to the speaker yesterday requesting an emergency debate regarding this government's upcoming failure to meet their deadline to close the infrastructure gap for Indigenous peoples by 2030. We now know that the infrastructure gap for Indigenous communities is about $350 million. Billion dollars. My apologies. Behind that number are communities across Canada where homes are overcrowded and unsafe, including in my riding. Schools are crumbling. There are no functional ports. 28 communities are still under long-term boil water advisories. The government promised there would be none by March 2021. But here we are in 2023, and there are still Canadians who don't have clean drinking water. We all know this would never happen in Toronto or Vancouver. This government will not meet its deadline. Since 2016, it has spent less than 3% of what's needed to close the gap. Now we see the government is planning on sunsetting many critical programs and services that Indigenous peoples rely on. At the end of this fiscal year, funding for mental health and wellness will sunset. We're facing a decrease in funding for Indigenous infrastructure projects and for the health and safety of First Nations on reserve housing, water, and community infrastructure. Do you see any possibility that the infrastructure gap, which is really a quality of life gap, a health and safety gap, can be closed and on the with only 3% right now of the necessary spending that's been allocated? Can you speak about the importance of this actually being closed and how we're going to get there?
So I have no knowledge of the First Nations infrastructure gap. No knowledge of the quantifiable gap. We have not looked at that specific issue ourselves, but we have looked at the water and wastewater issue a couple of years ago, and we found that there was no gap in the capital spending itself, but a significant gap in the operating funding for the operations of water and wastewater. So I can only speak about that specific aspect, not the overall infrastructure.
Can you speak about the operating in terms of renewing programs like that and how long the funding is set to end before they announce its renewal?
Yeah,
on the operating side?
In about 20 seconds.
If memory serves me well, there was sufficient funding for infrastructure, for wastewater and water, but insufficient funding to ensure the continuous operation of water and wastewater treatment plants in First Nations communities.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chambers, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Mr. Robson. It's a pleasure to have you here. when you were mentioning how your heart was skipping a beat about some changes in public accounting, I recall when I tell my wife how some things make me excited about public accounting and she tells me to get a life, but making no comments about the things that make you excited, but it's nice to be in a room with others that get excited about the same things. On yesterday's television, you did an interview yesterday where you said you were concerned that the government's budget numbers would deteriorate over the next short period. Could you just expand on that briefly?
It's partly a matter of concern about the economy, and there's nothing unusual in that and nothing dramatically different from what the government showed in its numbers. It's worth commenting just quickly, though, on the reliability of the projections. One of the comments that I made at the time of the fall economic statement was that we are now on the verge of the 2024-25 fiscal year, which was the final year in the projections in the government's fall economic statement in 2019. And spending in that year, the projected spending for that year has gone up by more than $100 billion over that period. So on average, every year, $25 billion more dollars. Now, partly that's inflation, and we can debate the degree to which the inflation was actually caused by fiscal policy. I think it certainly bears some responsibility for it, so you don't get a total pass on that. But the other thing that's happening is that we're getting fiscal frameworks delivered with very straightforward knowledge that there's more spending to come that's not in them. And so I do have concerns a little bit along the lines of what I expressed earlier, that we're kind of being trained not to take these things seriously. If a fiscal framework is announced, a formal budget presented, or a fall economic statement, and then a matter of days later there's an announcement of a significant new program that wasn't in it, then it does kind of undermine the value of the process itself. And our hearts should all beat faster when that happens. I do mean it not just as flattery to this group when I say that the work of parliamentarians in forums like this is absolutely critical to holding governments to account. And so when you see a framework that's laid out as though we should take it seriously, and you know there are significant spending programs that are not yet accounted for in it, you have to put up your hand and object and say we're not actually getting the numbers that matter here. The other thing I'll quickly say, if I haven't run out of time, is that we've got the debt to GDP ratio as a very hard indicator. It's widely accepted as a measure of fiscal prudence. It should be going down, and it's not. It's going up. So that's just the wrong direction of a very basic number.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robson. The Bank of Canada has been pretty clear, actually, in recent times that it's recommending that all governments restrain spending to 2%, 2.5% growth year over year. When asked after the fall economic statement what the growth rate or what the spending growth rate increase was, the Department of Finance had no answer for that number. And there is some confusion about whether it's nominal growth rate or real. The Department of Finance actually did not calculate that number. Do you find it weird or bizarre that the Department of Finance isn't tracking to a recommendation that the Bank of Canada has made in order to bring inflation down?
I haven't done the calculation that you mentioned in that exact way, but let me just sort of reinforce the point that I think Governor Macklem was making. The economy is operating at capacity. If governments are spending at a rate, if they're increasing their spending at a rate that's faster than the productive capacity of the economy can grow, then it's making the job of monetary policy more difficult because the economy is kind of running too hot. But the other thing that's important to mention is that if you're increasing your share of GDP that's going to the federal government, something else has to shrink. Right now, we are in a pretty severe housing crunch. We need at least to be maintaining the share of our GDP that we are putting into housing, or the shortage is going to get worse. We also need to raise the share of our GDP that's going into capital investment because it's too low. Capital per worker is falling, and that's why productivity is falling and living standards aren't rising. So it's a problem if the federal government is projecting its share of the economy that it uses directly to increase, and it's a problem if the rate of growth of government spending is exceeding what the economy can produce.
Thanks very much. That is our time. Mr. Kuzmierczak.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and I want to pick up on a point that Mr. Robson had raised about productivity, and some folks talk about spending. I like to call it investment, and what we've seen in the last 3 years is over $30 billion worth of foreign and direct investment. Canada's number 3 in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. We've seen $30 billion of investment in the last 3 years in the clean tech sector. You have incredibly innovative companies, global world-class companies setting up shop here in Canada. Obviously, Stellantis, LG, building batteries. In my hometown, LG is a world leader in battery manufacturing. Volkswagen in St. Thomas, again, multi-billion-dollar investment. Northvolt in Quebec. And then you have a number of other companies like Umicore up and down the supply chain that is going to be building cathodes. POSCO, GM. Again, these are all incredibly innovative companies. Do you see the potential, the opportunity for productivity gains with these companies setting up shop in Canada, highly innovative companies, especially through whether it's tech transfer, whether it's knowledge transfer? Just curious if you could maybe speak to that.
I tend to be an optimist when it comes to the ability of emerging technologies to let us all earn better livings in jobs that are safer and cleaner and more rewarding. So I am fundamentally optimistic about that. The trouble is that when I look at Canada over the last number of years, I'm just not seeing the kind of investment performance here that we're seeing in the United States and that we're seeing in other OECD countries. When you compare investment per worker in Canada over the last few years to that in the United States and the OECD countries, we're falling behind. We had closed the gap with the United States considerably. We were never all the way there. They're a very high investment economy. In the middle of the last decade, we had actually closed the gap entirely with the rest of the OECD. And lately, it's off a lot. And what's particularly concerning is that we're falling behind the United States most in the areas that we would most like to see high investment rates in. And you touched on the sectors. I'm not talking about the particular companies, but when it comes to machinery and equipment investment, the average Canadian worker is now getting less than 60 cents on the dollar per investment dollar enjoyed by the typical U.S. worker. The situation with respect to the OECD is a little better, but we're nowhere close to them. When it comes to intellectual property products, so software and the intangibles that a lot of us expect are really going to drive progress over the next little while, investment per worker in Canada is barely a quarter of what it is per worker in the United States. And this is quite a recent development. So I'm encouraged when I hear...
If you don't mind, Mr. Robson, I want to interrupt you for a second because, again, obviously with the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., the Canadian government had to respond. But these companies have a choice. They could set up shop. These are international global companies, Volkswagen, Stellantis, LG, Northvolt. These companies could go to the United States and get the same deal financially that they're getting in Canada. Why are global companies confidently investing in Canada? We're seeing that.
Well, partly it's because we have a dynamic automotive sector, and so the infrastructure is there. It's an attractive place to be. It's got a trained workforce. There are a lot of good reasons to invest in Canada. I worry that a little bit too much of it is related to government subsidies. When you have long-term fiscal pressures, and we already heard a little bit about that.
But the subsidies are the same. So Canada and the U.S. are in direct competition, and we're actually beating the United States in terms of major global investors here. So I would, is it not outside the realm of possibility that the investments that we're making, for example, in childcare, the investments that we're making in, for example, healthcare, those are the things that are making a big difference when companies decide they want to locate on this side of the border and not on the U.S. side.
I'm very encouraged.
I mean, the numbers are indicating we are the number 3 destination in the world for foreign direct investment, and it's only going higher.
The numbers on capital investment generally tell a totally different story to what you've just said. Canada is getting cents on the dollar per dollar invested per typical U.S. worker. In Switzerland, investment per worker is double what it is in Canada. We are simply not equipping our workers as well. I'm glad of the individual success stories, but when you look at the numbers across the board, they're not so encouraging. I think Canada should be doing more to incent investment of various kinds. We do have to match the United States when it comes to depreciation. It's possible that we could do a lot better on some of the intangible investment if we had a special lower tax rate for intellectual property derived income, as a number of countries, including the United States, have done. So there are things that we could be doing. But in general, right now, when I look at the numbers on investment, I see the capital stock falling per worker as it's now done for 7 years. That has not happened since the 1930s and the Second World War. I do not think the prospects for turning our performance in terms of real wage growth and living standards around are good if we do not get those global investment numbers out. I'm happy to hear about the individual stories, but when you tot it up across the board,
Sorry, Mr. Robson, I have to cut you off there.
And Mr. Chair, I'd like to put forward a notice of motion, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm afraid your time's up. Can we wait till the end, Mr. Kuzmierczak, and take care of it then?
Yep.
Ms. Vignola, please, for 2.5.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Giroux, over the last few months, we've talked a lot about consultants and about the fact that we should better make use of the public service's expertise and better respect the public service. Now, when it comes to training at the School of Public Service, I noticed that the budget hasn't changed, even though there might be new training that should be offered. Isn't there a dichotomy or a contradiction in saying we want a better public service, we want to reduce the number of external consultants, but we're not going to invest in training in the public service? And is there any other amount of money that is set aside for training aside from the School for Public Service? Yes, every department has a specific envelope for training, and that falls under the regular operational costs. There are trainings that are purchased from other providers. The School of Public Service also functions on a cost recovery basis. So it might appear that its budget is not increasing, but it is selling its training and resources to departments so that our employees have access to that. So if I understand correctly, it would be difficult to determine what the exact amounts are that are invested in the government for training staff. You would have to create a new line in the budget. Well, you would have to ask each and every organization how much they spend on training. And then you would have to distinguish between training writ large and language training, which accounts for a part of the training budget.
For 2.5.
So, Mr. Giroux, as you have reported, spending on professional and special services continues to increase and will likely keep increasing for the rest of this fiscal year. Have you developed any formula or analysis that would explain to us how much the government could save by moving public sector work and services from consultants to the public service?
It's not something that we have developed, but we know by talking to certain senior public servants in specific areas, notably IT, that the use of consultants is much more expensive than doing the same work in-house, having it done by public servants. And in that case, the issue is the availability of the skills and expertise. So in many areas, even if the public service wanted to recruit more IT specialists, it could not. And that's why, in large part, it's relying on consultants. But we have not done the study.
Sure. So if we cut $1 billion in IT consulting, how much will we need to spend on the public service to move that capacity in-house is kind of where I'm going. And would the savings get even, better over time as the public services capabilities kind of increase, that we might save it there? Or would that be something that you would believe that would be the, cost savings to taxpayers?
Well, in IT, it certainly would be the case, because what we heard from senior public servants is that when they have to go through consultancies, it costs significantly more than if they were to do it in-house by public servants. The issue being that they can't find the bodies that would do the job in-house. But if that was possible, it certainly would be significantly cheaper. That's what we've heard from senior public servants.
Do you believe even the recruitment, like the headhunters that, we hear of companies making $11 million in commissions that aren't even IT experts, that they're just good at finding companies to do the outsourcing work? Do you believe that we could save money bringing that role in-house and save on those commissions?
It's not an industry with which I'm familiar, so I could not comment on that specific aspect.
Sadly, we're becoming too familiar with it.
Thanks, Mr. Johns. Ms. Block, please, for 5.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll see if I need to use all of my time, because I know you need some time at the end. Mr. Robson, in the brief that you sent to our committee a couple of weeks ago, you did raise the concern about the average citizen's ability to follow the government's spending and how this actually has an impact on their ability to know how their tax dollars are being spent. We've also talked about the need for legislators to understand the financial statements, and I did appreciate the report card when it came to the various provinces across our country, and I'm very pleased to see where my province of Saskatchewan landed on your report card. I also want to refer back to something that you said in your opening remarks. You indicated that, Canada is in a good place in relation to some other countries, and Mr. Giroux earlier in the meeting agreed that we needed to actually, or it was feasible to ask for more detailed information from governments. And so I'm going to pose the question to both of you. Just wondering if you have, if you could point us in the direction of any other jurisdictions that we should be looking at for some perhaps best practices or better practices than what we are using today to ensure that we are getting the kind of information that we need as legislators, and that our citizens actually know how their tax dollars are being spent.
Chair, shall I go first?
Sure, go ahead, Mr. Robson.
Canada being at the forefront when it comes to the quality of our public sector accounting standards can't as easily import from abroad as we could if we were in a worse position. So what I would respond by way of what I hope is a constructive answer to your question is to say, if you look across the jurisdictions in Canada, if you look across the senior governments, and in fact, even the municipal governments, I criticize their budgets, but when you look at their financial statements, you'll see something that you see in the good senior governments as well. You will see when they publish their results at the end of the year, it's the entire statement of operations, all the revenue, all the expense is on one page, clean audit opinion. And in just about every case, they've got the comparison to the budget, ideally not restated budget numbers. That's a little bit of a thorn in the side of people who are trying to go back to the budget and see, did you actually do what you said you were going to do? But in every case, just about with the major cities in Canada, you will see the financial statements are so cleanly laid out that way. And as I say, they get clean audit opinions. I'm happy, since you mentioned Saskatchewan, to say that Saskatchewan and Alberta produce their public accounts within 3 months to the end of the fiscal year. There's no reason why other governments can't do the same thing. So if you like our table, if you simply look across the governments in each criterion and you say, well, what would happen if we were able to level up across the governments? Well, if Yukon can put the key numbers on page 8 of its budget, I don't have it in front of me right now, but it's something like that, right? Like if they can do it, anybody can do it. Anybody could do it. The federal government could do it in the upcoming spring budget. So we can do a lot simply by looking across the country.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Mr. Giroux?
If you're looking at jurisdictions where it's easier in Canada to reconcile the budget and the estimates process, I think Australia is a good example where they have an integrated finance and treasury board equivalent. So it's one department, so it facilitates the construction of their budget and their estimates process, making the job of legislators easier.
Thank you very much.
And if I may just say, we have Canadian provinces that do the same. So it's not as though you even have to go to the other side of the world. You can look right next door.
Thanks. Anything else, Ms. Blanc? Wonderful. I will note from my colleagues around the table that Minister Bryce, when we were studying the estimates about 7 years ago, suggested we actually go to Australia to study there, but we didn't. Yes, Mr. Sousa, please, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to share a minute of my time with my colleague, Mr. Kazmierczak, and before I go into questions. So over to you.
Here we go. We got the last one.
Go to you, Eric.
Mr.
Great.
Kuzmic,
Thank you
you're
so
just
much.
reading this into the record?
I think it was distributed as I understand it by the clerk. Does it need to be read into the record? This is just a notice of motion.
Yeah, please just go ahead.
Okay, so that the committee hold one meeting on the PBO's report entitled Costing Support for EV Battery Manufacturing, published on November 17, 2023, and that the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Yves Giroux, be invited to appear for the first hour, and Flavio Volpe, who is the APMA president, also be invited to appear for the second hour.
Wonderful. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Are we turning that over to Mr. Sousa now?
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Robson, good to see you again. It's been some time, and I've always appreciated your input and engagement in preparations of provincial and federal budgets and economic forecasts, and you were always a great help. And I do want to acknowledge some of what you said today in regards to sort of the fiscal stimulus and the countercyclical engagement of the government fiscal plan when it is going through times of crisis like we did now with regards to the pandemic, and the ability to sustain some of our spending in order to make certain it's by way of investment, like infrastructure. I think you captured that very well, or capital engagement, to ensure that we attract investment and growth in business and enablement of economic vibrancy. And some of that input, of course, is via provincial matters, right? So provinces play a role as well as the federal government. And the federal government has done quite a bit, but at the same time, the provincial governments, especially during the pandemic, cut back quite a bit. To the point, even prior to the pandemic, a number of those provinces' credit ratings were reduced. So here we have a federal government with a strong credit rating and has continued to maintain it. Some provincial governments have gone forward and some revenue cuts were made. I'm thinking of Ontario particularly, where I was part of, and it reduced its credit rating. Consequently, it's been downgraded. So, Mr. Robson, I want to, before I get into my real question, which is something separate around the pension plan, can you just reaffirm the direction and the priority that you feel is important for us to continue to invest in infrastructure, in capital investment, and secure, my colleague has mentioned, in respect to maintaining Canada's top destination for foreign direct investment?
I do think the federal government has a strong role to play in investing in infrastructure under its jurisdiction, so I would never quarrel with that. The topic of the federal government spending in areas of provincial jurisdiction came up earlier. One of the things that does concern me as the federal government expands its fiscal footprint is that it is both crowding out the future revenue sources that the provinces might need and also exposing them to the cutbacks that may well occur at some point in the future when the federal government feels itself to be a little fiscally overextended as well, with interest payments growing and so on. Having been a provincial finance minister, you know what it's like seeing the federal government not coming through with the money that you were expecting, or finding that you're constrained in raising the revenues that you need yourself as a result of the federal government already being in the field. So I would like to see the federal government spending smarter and in a more focused way, because the provinces in the long run are the ones who are carrying the can when it comes to healthcare and a lot of the other infrastructure needs the country has. So each in its lane.
I appreciate your comments in that regard, and certainly we want transparency by way of our transfers to those federal governments. Certainly, I always wanted that to be the case when we were looking at health transfers, to ensure that we held accountable as to where some of that spending would occur. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily happen. And when you look at the province of Ontario having a cap and trade system exempt from the carbon pricing and enabling another $1.5 billion in revenues to be eliminated, it seems a little careless and political in by way of decisions. But my other question I want to get to, because I know we're out of time, is Alberta. Alberta is now, and you're big into the pension plans, and we've had a lot of debates, you and I, over the past years, and they were very fruitful for me because they were very enlightening. And when Ontario was looking forward to putting the Ontario pension plan as a supplement, as an add-on to CPP, we were able to initiate that and leverage the enhancement of CPP, which I think was better for all of Canada, not just by way of looking only at Ontario. What is your take on Alberta putting at risk, if you see it as such?
And that is our time. I appreciate.
Oh no, it's a good question.
I appreciate you dragging provincial politics into.
Can you send that in writing?
But perhaps we need
Happy to take it up later.
As Mr. Robson says, stay in our lane. But I appreciate your attempt. We are done here. Before we excuse the witnesses, because we have a few minutes of committee business, I want to thank Mr. Giroux and his team, as always, for being with us. I've mentioned it before, as you're like George Martin, you are like the fifth Beatle, you are the extra member of OGGO. So truly appreciate that. Mr. Robson, thank you for your time. We wish we could have seen you here in person perhaps another time. Certainly appreciate you being with us today. But before you go, Mr. Giroux, just a quick request, Chair's prerogative. In spring, the government appropriated, X amount of money for specific programs. I'm hoping that, I'm thinking they should report now on these programs that they're not going to spend the money on that they have appropriated. We've seen them come forward with $500 million in announced reductions in money that has already been approved. I wonder if your office would perform an analysis on the cuts in services to the programs with the $500 million, similar to the one that PBO did in 2012, specifically on those.
If
$500.
if it's the desire of the committee through a motion, I'd be
Colleagues,
happy
we have
to do
your agreement for a rather simple request? Yes. Any objections?
No objection. But can we just have the text of it, what you're specifically asking, and then I'm sure we'll support it.
I can read it out again.
Yes, please.
Just for the PBO's office to perform an analysis on cuts in services to programs with regards to the $500 million savings announced, similar to the one performed by the PBO April 2012.
So basically, we want to understand what is the nature of the $500 million saving.
Yep.
Okay.
Whether it's lapsed or what it is.
That's
right. More clear. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We'll release our witnesses. And we're just going to go. Thanks very much. You can hang around and listen to the real fun stuff now if you wish. But just very quickly, everyone, we need to approve the budget. I know it's a large amount, but we'll only spend we'll lapse probably 90% of it. So if I have approval for the $6,000 for the supplementary estimates studies.
For a bunch of muffins?
Yes, as I suspect, we will lapse.
No, I know. I'm just bugging you.
5,500.
I'm just bugging you.
Are we fine with that, colleagues?
Yes.
Wonderful. The one, if you recall, when we had Dalian and Cordix here, we had a fair amount of requests for documents. One of the ones was from Mr. Genuis for documents, but it's not 100%. He was asking for it from the government to provide, but we kind of need to restate it for Dalian's benefit. Precise, I'm going to just read this to you. On October 26th, the order for production documents was adopted was ambiguous as to who was tasked to provide the documents to the committee, Dalian or the government. It is the government, but Dalian is looking just for us to confirm that. They have some concerns about being held in contempt for not providing it. To do so, though, we need to discharge the original order and replace it with one that is more specific, indicating wherever they want to oblige to provide the committee with the documents. The original motion, and sorry, bear with me, that the committee send for all contracts between a government department, agency, or crown corporations and GC Strategies, Dalian, and Cordix going back at least 12 years, and the unredacted documents be submitted to the clerk of the committee in both official languages in 3 weeks. I have proposed new wording here from our wonderful clerk, that the order pertaining to sending for contracts between the government department, agency, or Crown Corp and GC Strategies, Dalian, and Cordix, adopted by the committee on Thursday, October 26, 2023, be discharged and replaced with the following. Order that the clerk of the committee inform the government departments, agencies, or Crown Corps that the committee sends for a copy of all contracts between said departments, agencies, or Crown Corps and GC Strategies, Dalian and Cordix going back at least 12 years, and that the unredacted documents be submitted to the clerk of the committee in both official languages 3 weeks from Thursday, October 26, 2023. So it's the same motion, but it's just specifying the government, and that's just to alleviate Dalian's concerns about responsibility. Are we fine with that, colleagues? I do need unanimous consent. One.
Sorry, can we just take a few minutes to review this? Would that be okay?
Okay, we'll suspend for a couple moments. I thought we had agreement this earlier, but
what are we talking about?
colleagues, we are back in. Do we have consent for that, please? Yes. Appears to. Thanks very much. I appreciate that. Second item, orders for the production of documents. Dalian and Cordix are requesting that the committee turn all of their questions taken as notice during the meeting into order for the production of documents. So instead of when we've asked for items from them, would you provide it? They're asking it. Dalian is asking for it to be an official notice or official motion from the committee. It's rather simple, straightforward. Sorry. An official order of the committee. So they are just requesting that. So order that the clerk of the committee inform Dalian Cordix that the committee sends for a copy of the contract for the Bottler AI task authorization and that the documents be submitted to the clerk of the committee 3 weeks from Tuesday, October 31st by 12 p.m. Again, this is a request from Dalian just for clarification. So it changes that to an official order.
Wants to make sure that we are specifically asking him to send the contracts about Butler AI, TA, to the committee, to the clerk within 3 weeks.
Yeah, what it was originally, it was a request for doc. Would you table it? Yes, we will. They're asking us to make an official order of the committee.
Okay, that's fine.
I think it's their lawyer that
Quite possibly,
that's
but
fine.
okay. We're fine with that? Wonderful. Thanks very much. Another one, order that the clerk of the committee inform Dalian Cordix that the committee sends for a copy of the contracts that were signed by GC Strategies for the program set by CBSA to fulfill their obligations under Bill C-65, otherwise known as the Bottler Project, and the documents be submitted to the clerk of the committee 3 weeks on Tuesday, October 31st, 2023 by 12 p.m. It's the same issue as Dalian requesting. We have consent. Thank you very much. And last one. Oh, no, I've got more. I have 5. Sorry. Order that the clerk of the committee inform Dalian Cordix that the committee sends for a list of the government departments and agencies that Dalian and Cordix have had contracts with, and that the documents be submitted to the clerk of the committee 3 weeks from Tuesday, October 31st, 2023 by 12 p.m. Consent, colleagues?
All of these are.
These are all one.
Was here. We asked for these documents.
Yep.
They're just coming back and saying, "Can you formally send
Yes.
that?" As okay,
Yes.
That's fine.
This one I'll read, but I'll just comment. There's a tiny little problem. For order that the clerk of the committee inform Dalian Cordix that the committee sends for a copy of the number of joint ventures that Dalian and Cordix have gone into. B, a copy of how many joint ventures Dalian and Cordix have gone into that were not connected to the Indigenous Set-Aside Program, and the documents be submitted to the clerk of the committee 3 weeks from Tuesday, 31st by 12 p.m. It's the same issue, a request from Dalian, where, let me just finish, where it is a small issue. It's not exactly an order for production of documents. It's order for them to provide an answer. But again, this is something that they've asked for.
To be honest with you, Kelly, I feel a bit rushed on. I understand the purpose. That's what I'm coming. Is there a way that we could get that 5? We don't have any issue with it. We are agreeing to too many things, and our team is not comfortable.
Yeah, that's why.
And I'm not comfortable.
Yeah, that's why
I'm glad if you send it to us ahead of time.
Sure.
We look at it. We'll support it. That's not an issue.
Yeah. So we can. Thanks.
We can put 5 minutes at the end of Tuesday and go through it.
Yeah. I will send it out. I will just reiterate. These are all things that we've agreed upon.
We have the pretext of it.
Yeah, we've all agreed upon, and this is wording suggested to clarify by the clerk. This is not by myself.
Yeah.
Or any specific party.
I think the team has the context of what's being asked.
So
we're just
there's a
of abundance of cautious. We just want to have a look at it.
Sure, we've agreed to the other one. So there's the fourth item, 4 and 5. We'll resend or we'll send out. We can look
if
at
you could send all the 5 and say the first 3 is agreed, the other 2 are sending.
We'll hopefully agree to them very quickly.
Sure.
The last one was just on Poseidon documents. Similar thing where PSPC has agreed to send a document, but despite our best requests, has not. So we wish to make it a
So
formal
things
request.
like that, honestly, even if we can get it 24 hours before, we'll have a chance to review it. We'll commit that it will be a
Okay.
very short conversation.
That's fine.
We just need some time to reflect. I'm
Yeah.
a slow processor, so.
As I mentioned, it's stuff we've
Eh,
already agreed upon, but Dalian's
Yeah.
asking. Or
I
rather,
agree.
their lawyer.
I agree.
Wonderful. If there's nothing else,
Just
sorry.
can we talk about the Rivcan and who else we're going to invite? Because I'd
Sure.
like to
Why
invite.
don't I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Pendant qu'on est dans
While we're looking at committee motions, November 8th, I made a notice of motion about the Avocent firm for the P8 to Poseidons. Is it possible to discuss it quickly? I think there's unanimous consent.
It's the sixth item today that we're just asking for the committee to issue it as an order from the committee, as they have not. Are you fine waiting a couple days or till the next
It's
meeting?
okay.
We'll clear with the
Parfait.
others. Wonderful. Hold on. We're done. We're out of resources. Is it something really quick?
Yeah, I just want to
Really
I just want to make sure that we add to the list of witnesses for ArriveCan. I'm suggesting that Ms. O'Gorman and the HR labor relation responsible for CBSA to come back because there's lots of conversation back and forth about pilot and that and what they were asking and why the
I think we
contract.
already agreed on Ms. O'Gorman, but if you'd provide the other name,
Yeah,
we will
I'll
get
provide
that.
the other. Our office will provide the other name because there's a lot of confusion right now between was it a pilot, was it a thing, and whether HR canceled it, whether it was no, or it was missed. So it would be good if we get those coming
very
into
quickly.
Holland.
Then I'm going to adjourn. We will do that. There's been other names bounced around from all parties. I've
Absolutely.
had. If there's
Absolutely.
others, would you please provide it to your committee lead or
Yeah.
Mr. Johns or Ms. Minola? Just send it forward.
Okay.
Thanks, colleagues. Oh, very, very quick. We're out of time, Mr. Souza.
Yeah, I just want to make certain that the translation, I just want to just to confirm that we will have translation in period of time, that it won't be available in terms of our issue. Is that right?
No. There was the CD Howe report that he was referring to that we offered to translate, but Ms. Vignola read it already.
Is that it? No, it
Was
was.
there an issue, Ms. Vignola?
pas de problème. À moins que le rapport.
No issue unless the report is used, the CD Howe report is used in our report. If it's not used in our report, then it's not necessary.
Okay, colleagues, we are adjourned. Thanks for your patience.